makers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, President Trump says he has pitched a one-on-one meeting with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, and the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, that would be followed by a trilateral summit involving all three of them. It comes after his Monday meeting with Zelensky and several European leaders at the White House. Now, anxious to avoid the disastrous shouting match that ruined his last visit, Zelensky repeatedly thanked President Trump for his involvement. The gathering was a win for Western allies who'd flown to Washington in a bid to steer President Trump away from a quick deal with Russia at Ukraine's expense. While security guarantees for Kyiv were the key focus of the meeting.
In a very significant step, President Putin agreed that Russia would accept security guarantees for Ukraine, and this is one of the key points that we need to consider, and we're going to be considering that at the table also, like who will do what, essentially. I'm optimistic that collectively we can reach an agreement that would deter any future aggression against Ukraine, and I think that the European nations are going to take a lot of the burden. We're going to help them, and we're going to make it very secure.
It's important that the United States send a clear signal that it will be among the countries that helps coordinate and participate in security guarantees for Ukraine. I believe this is a big step forward. While I can't yet disclose all the details, the political will and decisions are already in place, and that's what's important.
Well, joining us now is Bildt. He's co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations and, of course, former Prime Minister of Sweden. Mr. Bildt, thank you for joining us. What was your main takeaway from what we saw in the White House yesterday?
Well, I think the most important thing that happened was really what did not happen. I mean, the European leaders rushed to Washington after the disaster in Alaska in order to prevent Trump from sort of forcing Zelensky into some sort of dirty deal. That did not happen. That was success. Then, as for the rest, he still seems to be very reluctant to urge a ceasefire of the sort that was the centerpiece of the Western approach up until Alaska. And whether these bilateral meetings that Trump is talking about will materialize remains to be seen. Details on security arrangements, that's good that there was a discussion, but the devil is in the details, so remains to be seen. But it prevented something that could have been even worse.
So, Mr. Bildt, we did spend a lot of the better half of the early part of the week talking about Alaska and how it was a clear win for Vladimir Putin. Is it now less of a win, or is it still a Putin win, but the Europeans at least were united and got a seat at the table?
Well, Alaska is still a win for Putin, because what Putin managed to do in Alaska was, of course, to say to Trump, forget about this ceasefire thing. Prior to that, of course, Trump has said, ceasefire, and if you don't do ceasefire, I take measures. All of that went out through the window, and that win remains, unfortunately. You heard some of the European voices, Merz and Macron, saying yesterday, we need a ceasefire. But Trump doesn't seem to be receptive to that. But what happened yesterday was that he did not pressure Zelensky into making sort of these land swaps that he evidently discussed with Putin. Says land swaps or whatever you call them are for Zelensky and Putin to discuss, fair enough. Try to set up a meeting between the two of them, fair enough. Is that going to happen? Unlikely, I would say.
What do you think happens from now until the end of the year? Is there, a 15 or even higher % chance of some kind of truce or peace?
I think likelihood is less than it was before Alaska, and I don't think the meeting yesterday changed that very much, unfortunately.
I mean, I guess there are a couple of things, of course, that Europe wants to focus on. It's working on this trilateral meeting, possibly trying to have a little bit more policy substance on what kind of backing the U.S. would have. And then the third is basically giving up land. What do you think of those three is the most achievable?
Well, I think giving up land is going to be very difficult for Zelensky, particularly the giving up land that Mr. Putin is asking for, the remaining of the Donetsk region. That is really heavily defended areas that the Ukrainians have been defending with great success. now for 30 or 32 months or whatever it is by now, that they should give that up, their well-fortified positions. I think that's extremely unlikely. It's not going to happen. So we can forget about that for the time being. Whether there are other things that can be sorted out in the bilateral meeting, that remains to be seen. But so far, we have seen Mr. Putin very reluctant to engage directly with Mr. Zelensky. They have these talks on a lower level that produces very little. Mr. Putin, of course, prefers to deal with Mr. Trump because he believes that he can get Mr. Trump to agree to certain things, which so far has proved to be correct. So exactly where we are a couple of weeks down the road, we are probably further along when it comes to discussing some sort of security guarantee for the rather uncertain time when the war has ended. And that's not a bad thing.
Carl Bildt, why do you think, I mean, actually, the question is probably, is Vladimir Putin now normalized? Has he come back, into international politics because he was uninvited on U.S. soil? And what's the reason President Trump has done this?
Well, I mean, from the Russian point of view, Alaska was a triumph. The Russians have they've had this nostalgia for the old days when the Soviet Union and the United States were the two superpowers, and the two of them could have their summit meetings and decide the future of the world. This looked like it was back to the old days, with all of the bombers flying by and honors and whatever. So they're immensely satisfied with the optics of it. And they are satisfied also with the substance, in the sense that he got him off threats if he didn't do a ceasefire. They're probably less satisfied after yesterday because they had probably expected Trump to put very heavy pressure on Zelensky to do some sort of land deal. It doesn't seem like he did that at all, which is a good thing. So the next step between Moscow and Washington remains to be seen. I understand that sort of J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio are going to task with setting up that bilateral Zelensky-Putin meeting. The best of luck to the gentlemen.
Yeah, Friedrich Merz, I think, says that the Putin-Zelensky talks could take place within 2 weeks. Emmanuel Macron says the trilateral, then with also President Trump, may be held within 3 weeks. I mean, can any concrete action happen with so little time?
Unlikely, I would say. I mean, nothing is to be excluded in the world, but I would not put very many money, if any money at all, on there being a bilateral meeting within 2 weeks and a trilateral meeting within 3 weeks. I think that is still very unlikely.
Mr. Bildt, maybe final question on, we understand, of course, that the Europeans really wanted to make sure that the U.S. promised to underwrite the future of Ukrainian security, and that was central to the discussions yesterday. What do you think will happen in that space?
Yeah, there was evidently some sort of movement. Exactly what it was remains to be seen. They are saying they're going to work further on it, on the details of it in the next few days and weeks. And I think that will be important to find out what that actually is. And it is, of course, long-term very important, when there is an end of the war and some sort of, I don't think it's going to be peace, but end of the fighting. And we resume the process of EU accession and all of that for Ukraine, we need also to help with the security of Ukraine. And the Europeans can do and will do a lot, but there's a need for some sort of US engagement in that. And clearly the Americans opened up for that. That is very important, but exactly what it entails, the devil is in the details, as I said, but exactly what it entails remains to be seen. But work in progress and in the right direction.
Thank you so much. As ever, great to speak to you again. Carl Bildt, there, the co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations and the former Prime Minister of Sweden. Now, Softbank has agreed to buy $2 billion worth of Intel stock in a surprise deal to shore up the struggling U.S. chip maker. Meanwhile, Bloomberg has also learned that the Trump administration is in discussions to take a stake of about 10% in the company. Let's get more with our Tom McKenzie. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. So first of all, what's the motive behind, the Softbank stake?
Yeah, there's a couple of clear takeaways from this news that Softbank is investing $2 billion in Intel. One is about the Softbank ecosystem itself. So Masayoshi Son really trying to build out their stakes, his position in terms of the infrastructure that's underpinning this AI revolution. So, of course, they own ARM, which has some role to play. They have investments in NVIDIA, they have investments in TSMC, and now they have investments and will have this investment in Intel. So it's part of that as Masayoshi Son is trying to get more exposure to the upside that's come through from AI. And so far, that exposure that he's had has been relatively limited. The other key takeaway is that this is a vote of confidence, clearly, for Intel that has been under pressure because of cost cutting, because of jobs, and because of the fact that they're paying catch up to NVIDIA when it comes to AI accelerators. But it's also a vote of confidence in the Trump administration strategy, quite frankly, of reshoring a lot of that chip manufacturing capacity back to the US. And Masa and SoftBank were really clear that they believe that that is going to be successful and that this is partly a bet on that story of a US resurgence on the back of chip manufacturing.
And what more do we know about the U.S. government's plans to buy a stake in Intel?
So, of course, Bloomberg had reported last week that they were looking at buying the stake, and now we have more details on how that could form up and how that could shape up. So potentially 10% stake. So the U.S. government would, in that scenario, be the biggest shareholder of Intel. And what you'd be looking at doing, according to our reporting, is potentially changing the investments that Intel has received from the CHIPS Act, the subsidies, into equity holdings. So far, Intel has received about $2.2 billion through that US CHIPS Act. It is on track to receive close to $11 billion. And the idea is that you convert those subsidies into a US government equity holding in Intel. There's a big focus from the Trump administration on the projects they had lined up in Ohio, massive foundries manufacturing chips. Those have been delayed repeatedly because of the cost overrun and the fact they don't have major clients and major customers to buy from those foundries. The Trump administration wants to make sure that those plans go ahead, and this seems to be part of that direction. But it's also a reminder that the Trump administration now is piecing together something of an industrial strategy. They invested in a rare earths mineral company. They're taking 15% of revenues from NVIDIA and AMD in terms of those sales into the Chinese market. So it's part of the bigger picture as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting the fact that, the Intel chief executive was definitely the target of Donald Trump and then went to the White House to try and pivot him. Tom, thank you so much. Tom McKenzie on the very latest with Intel. Coming up, we talked to Bill Browder, founder and chief executive of Hermitage Capital, on the prospects for a Putin-Zelenskiy meeting. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Well, President Trump has called Vladimir Putin to urge him to begin making plans for a summit with the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Now, attention is now firmly on Putin and whether he would agree to direct talks before a possible trilateral meeting to include the United States. Well, my next guest was the largest foreign investor in Russia in the 1990s. He's the author of the best-selling book, Freezing Order, a sequel to Red Notice. He continues his fight for justice after his lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was murdered in a Russian prison. Bill Browder, chief executive of Hermitage Capital, joins us now. Bill, thank you, as always, for giving us a little bit of your busy schedule. I know you, know Russia and also Putin quite intimately. How did he turn the situation around to actually have a pretty good week on the international front?
Well, there's this strange affection, affinity, and respect that comes from Donald Trump, and for reasons that almost nobody can understand, Donald Trump does not want to offend Putin. He does not want to punish Putin, and he somehow wants to be friends with him. And Putin has taken advantage of this. And I should point out, he's not the only president that started this way. There was George Bush looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul. Barack Obama wanted to do a reset, but this one is particularly difficult because Putin is in the middle of a war of aggression, murdering Ukrainians, and so this respect that Trump has for Putin and the deference which he gives him, Putin has played it for all it's worth, and Trump had threatened really crippling secondary sanctions on the sale of Russian oil if Putin didn't come to a ceasefire, and I think that was the thing that triggered Putin to come to Alaska. And in Alaska, we don't know what went on behind closed doors, but at the end of that meeting, there were no crippling sanctions, and all of a sudden there was no demand for a ceasefire.
Yeah, and we saw, I thought we saw actually a pretty impressive diplomatic initiative by Europe yesterday, showing up at the White House, trying to support President Zelensky as much as they could. I think Chancellor Merz also asked for a ceasefire. Where are we now? Could we actually see some kind of agreement between Ukraine and Russia, or is this wishful thinking?
There's not going to be any agreement between Ukraine and Russia. One of the things I read this morning was a readout from the Kremlin of the phone call that they had last night between Trump and Putin. And the readout from the Kremlin is totally different than what everyone else is talking about. But there's the idea that there's supposed to be a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin is not what the Kremlin is talking about. The Kremlin is in their readout is saying that it's been agreed that there should be more meetings between the Russian government and the Ukrainian government, which they've already had. And then it went on to say, and in that context, the meeting should be higher level. In no way, shape, or form are they agreeing to a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. And taking a big step back from this whole thing, it's very clear to anyone who knows what Putin is up to that he doesn't want to end this war. And he doesn't want to end the war on any terms that we've been floating around out there about land swapping or anything like that. What Putin wants to do is a total subjugation of Ukraine. He doesn't want Ukraine to be an independent sovereign country anymore. He doesn't want Ukraine to have a military. He doesn't want Ukraine to have any type of independence, any foreign protection. He wants Ukraine to be part of Russia. And that's been his goal ever since the beginning of this whole terrible war. That continues to be his goal. The one thing you can say about Vladimir Putin is he's very transparent. He hasn't been in any way saying anything other than that. And so for everybody to be talking about security arrangements for Ukraine, we're putting the cart way before the horse because Putin doesn't want to do that. Putin wants this war to continue and he wants to win this war.
So, Bill, a couple of questions on the back of that. Why does Donald Trump say that Vladimir Putin wants peace? And actually, how do you think the fact that Vladimir Putin showed up in Alaska on U.S. soil, how is that playing out back home?
Well, so Putin's meeting in Alaska was the biggest success he could have ever had. First of all, it was symbolically amazing to have the red carpet rolled out on American territory, to have Donald Trump applaud him. That couldn't be better from a symbolic standpoint, but from a substantive standpoint, I believe that his main objective is to continue the war, and he was allowed to continue the war. And his second objective was not to have crippling economic sanctions imposed on his oil industry. And he was somehow able to continue the war, no ceasefire, and without any crippling economic sanctions. And so now he can drag it out and make all sorts of, slight, intimations of peace to Trump so that these negotiations go on into perpetuity, and he can continue the war until he hopes we give up. That's his goal, that's his idea, and that's what he'll continue to do.
So could you see a situation where Donald Trump actually normalizes, I guess, relationships with Russia economically in terms of businesses, but where the bombing of Ukraine continues?
I don't see that happening for one simple reason, which is what we saw yesterday at the White House, which is that it would be so against world opinion, first of all against U.S. opinion, but against world opinion. The fact that you had all these heads of state all showing up at the White House telling Trump, Putin's a bad guy, don't give in to him. That's what the message was. Don't attack Zelensky, be tough on Putin. And Trump is influenced by that. I mean, it was a very flattering thing for Donald Trump to have the entire, important people of the world all converge with like 24 hours notice on the White House to make this point. And his ego was stroked. He was flattered, and he's not going to go against the world so dramatically with everybody all coming in and showing him that deference.
Bill, do you see any progress on Europe seizing the 200 billion euros in Russia's central bank assets frozen in Europe to help Ukraine?
Well, I see sort of marginal progress, and it's very important. This is a potential game changer for Ukraine. The United States has stopped funding military aid for Ukraine, and the money needs to come from somewhere. The United Kingdom and most other European countries don't have the money to fill in the gap from where the United States was. And so it's got to come from somewhere. And the economic realities will say that that money should come from Vladimir Putin. And that money is sitting on account, 200 billion is sitting on account at Euroclear in Belgium. And it's sort of the obvious thing. I think the economic realities have to overcome the political hesitation, but I see that coming. I see a lot of movement in that direction, because at the end of the day, money is needed to continue to defend Ukraine, and that's got to be where that money comes from.
Bill, as always, thank you so much. Sir Bill Browder there, Chief Executive of Hermitage Capital. Now let's talk a little bit about the markets. We're joined by Ven Ram from our Markets Live team. Ven, a lot of the talk this week, of course, is on geopolitics, but what do you make of the currency and bond market reaction to news on Russia and Ukraine?
Morning, Francine. I think that the markets are a bit all over the place. They're a little bit subdued, principally for the reason that your previous guest, Bill Browder, was mentioning. You know, Kremlin seems to be on a completely different page here, and the markets are questioning how far this peace dividend and peace initiative can go. There is still a lot of hoops to jump through before the markets will catch on to the glee. If you look at oil prices, they haven't moved to lower much at all. So the markets seem to be, and equity prices are subdued as well in Europe. And that seems to suggest that the markets are questioning this peace dividend and how far we can get there and how quickly we can get there. So at the moment, the markets are saying, yes, progress has been made in the past 48, 72 hours, but the question marks are still big and large and looming.
So, Ven, traders onto the Bank of England, traders now reckon that the BOE won't be able to cut rates this year. Are they positioned right?
Well, they're both right and wrong, Francine, because they're right because, you know, there is very little room for the Bank of England to be able to cut rates. We've got the July inflation data coming up tomorrow. That is expected to show a print of 3.7% on the headline inflation. Core inflation is likely to hover around 4%. And services inflation is already around 5%. None of those metrics are clearly anywhere near the 2% BOE target. So the markets are saying, look, it will be a policy mistake if they cut rates in November. So they are assigning a very low probability of that event. But what we can't forget is that the Bank of England, at least quite a few members on the policy committee are dovish leaning, and they carried the weight through in August to ensure a rate cut. And even though the Bank of England thinks that inflation will peak down the line at 4%, they seem to be wanting to cut rates, which will be a policy mistake. And even though because of that, you know, there's the risk that because of the dovish leanings, it can't be ruled out that they can't cut further. So they're both right and wrong. For the reason right, because there is no policy room. Wrong, because the Bank of England may still shoehorn in another rate cut.
Very quickly, but in 20 seconds, German yield curve, pretty steep now. Where do we go from here?
Well, I think that steepness is going to persist for some more time to come because of the Dutch pension fund reform that is re-altering the demand status for swaps. And that swap curve is having an impact on what is happening with the yield curve as well. So that's going to persist in the short term.
Ven, as always, thank you so much, Ven Ram there. You can find him, of course, on the Bloomberg terminal and on our website. Coming up, we'll discuss where to find investment opportunities in emerging markets amid Trump's trade war and political uncertainty. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. Donald Trump pushes for a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky with the U.S. and European allies, now promising security guarantees for Kyiv. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi hails Vladimir Putin as a friend as his government also moves to bolster relations with China. Plus, a surprise from Softbank. The Japanese investor has agreed to make a $2 billion investment in Intel. This as the U.S. considers taking a 10% stake in the chip maker. Now, President Trump says he's called Vladimir Putin to urge him to begin making plans for a summit with Volodymyr Zelensky. It comes after his meeting with the Ukrainian president and several European leaders at the White House on Monday.
think that we had very good conversation with President Trump.
Very good.
And it really was the best one, maybe the best one will be in the future.
I think if we play this well, we could end this. And we have to end this. We have to stop the killing. We have to stop the destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure.
Now we are here to work together with you on a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. Stop the killing. This is really our common interest. Stop the killing.
The next steps ahead are the more complicated ones now. The path is open. You opened it last Friday. But now the way is open for complicated negotiations.
Everybody around this table is in favor of peace. And we work very hard, and we've worked very hard during the past few years to have a peace which is a robust and long-standing peace.
Well, joining us now is Oliver Crook in Brussels. Ollie, so what more do we know about the security guarantees for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that this is kind of the main takeaway that we've got since this meeting that happened with Trump and Putin on Friday and over the weekend, this idea beginning to emerge from a number of Trump's advisors, namely Steve Witkoff, that there would be these sort of Article 5 style guarantees that would in some way be furnished by the United States. They would be part of the security architecture. And I think for European leaders, that is really the thing that they needed to hear. I think they will be very reassured that in their trip to Washington, D.C. yesterday, this is something that was not just a sort of flash of the pan that was mentioned by a few advisors over the weekend. This is something that Donald Trump reiterated. Now, there's still a lot of ambiguity around what the Article 5 style guarantees mean. Does this mean basically a kind of de facto NATO membership for Ukraine without calling it NATO? Would it mean that the United States would enter a military conflict theoretically if ever Ukrainian sovereignty were imposed on again after a peace negotiation? Then there are also a lot of other questions about the idea of troops on the ground. What European nations would be willing to sort of commit them? I think that what the European leaders in Zelensky have learned from dealing with Donald Trump, particularly on the issue of Ukraine, is to not be the problem, do not complicate the situation. So as a consequence, all of these European leaders who showed up in a huge number yesterday in Washington, D.C., showed a very unified front. What, Francine, that papers over are a lot of very difficult conversations that are going to have to happen domestically when they get back home. It is all about how the Europeans are going to pay for this potential security guarantee going forward. And of course, many of the German officials that I have spoken to and a number of other European leaders, not everybody is totally convinced about the idea of sending their own military troops within Ukraine that might have to theoretically return fire if Russia were to once again impose on Ukraine. So these are some of the very difficult conversations that are now beginning. But one of the great sort of takeaways from the last couple of days is that there is work being done at the very highest level by the United States and the Europeans to try to hammer out what this Article 5-like structure will actually look like.
Ollie, what is the likelihood of this bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin and then the trilateral one involving President Trump?
Yeah, so what we know so far about that is that President Trump spoke to Vladimir Putin after the conversation with European leaders, and I'll just quote from him here what he put out on Truth Social shortly after the meeting. He said that at the conclusion of the meetings, I called President Putin and began arrangements for a meeting at a location to be determined between President Putin and President Zelensky. After these meetings take place, I will have a trilat, and that would be the two presidents plus myself. We're starting to see a little bit of reporting from some agencies across the wire. Reuters saying that meeting could potentially happen in Hungary over the next 2 weeks. I would take all of that with a grain of salt because nobody expected, for example, the Trump and Putin meeting to take place in Alaska. That being said, there were still a number of European leaders that were saying that basically it's impossible to imagine a trilateral meeting and to have these active discussions without a ceasefire. And we should say that ceasefire is not something that is a Trump priority after that meeting with Putin. So these are going to be kind of the things to watch over the next couple of weeks. Could that be the bilat in the next 2 weeks and potentially the trilat the 2 weeks after that? That being said, Francine, we're doing a little bit of guessing because there are a lot of unanswered questions still.
Yeah, many unanswered questions. It was interesting listening to Bill Browder saying that he read also the Kremlin transcript, but had a different version to what we've been told in the West. Ollie, thank you so much. As always, Oliver Crook there in Brussels. Now, the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has hailed Vladimir Putin as a friend after discussing bilateral cooperation with the Russian leader. The call comes as Modi's government also moves to bolster relations with China. Now, Modi is due to meet with the Foreign Minister Wang Yi today, as both nations push to normalize relations amid diplomatic tensions with the U.S.
We should develop confidence to dispel interference, expand cooperation, and to further consolidate the momentum of improvement and development of China-India relations so that while pursuing our respective rejuvenation, we can contribute to each other's success.
Having seen a difficult period in our relationship, Excellency, our two nations now seek to move ahead. This requires a candid and constructive approach from both sides.
Well, for more, let's bring in Suri Ranjan Sen, our government reporter in New Delhi. Thank you for joining us. So what can we actually expect from Wang's meeting with Modi later today?
Well, we are not expecting any major announcements from it, but the very messaging of it, the very optics around the meeting is what one is watching out for. Prime Minister Modi is going to China later this month. It is his first visit in 7 years, and therefore just shows the kind of frostiness that was there in the relation in the past few years, and how things have really turned around. And it happens amid President Trump threatening penalties on India, slapping India and China both with very high tariffs. Of course, the China tariffs have been held in abeyance. So there is this is happening at a time when there is a rethink perhaps in India as to which way should India forge and go ahead in its foreign relationship. And that is why this meeting with Wang Yi is important, and the meeting with in Beijing, which we expect later this month between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping.
Suri, so Modi also spoke with Vladimir Putin on his recent peace talks with Trump. What do we know about that?
Well, I mean, what we know about that is from the readouts that we have seen and from the briefings that we've got from in the Indian side. Largely discussions were around Putin's discussion in Alaska. He briefed Prime Minister Modi of what all happened, and the two leaders then continued to discuss the bilateral relationship. This is important because it comes at a time when President Trump had threatened India, and we have seen his aides, kind of squarely blaming India for funding Putin's war machine, which India kind of denies very vociferously. So these the call takes place in that background, and India clearly hasn't backed away from its Russia relationship or given any indication that it is willing to, scale down its engagement with Russia.
Suri, thanks so much. As always, our government reporter there, Suri Ranjan Sen. Now, joining us now is Giulia Pellegrini, Emerging Markets Portfolio Manager at Allianz Global Investors. Thank you for joining us, Giulia. I mean, there's many questions on India and China, but I mean, how is India actually rechanging geopolitics at the margin, and what does that mean for investment in the country?
Interesting times indeed. I mean, the saying that your enemy's enemy is your friend comes to mind at this time. Obviously, India has to play well because it has invested a lot in developing a strong relationship with Mr. Trump. President Modi himself personally has invested a lot in this, given that he was very close to him during Mr. Trump's first term. So recent news headlines around tariffs on India, up to 50% in case they don't stop buying Russian oil, have come as a real shock to the Indian leadership and to India as a whole. So this attempt to warm up relations with China isn't surprising. India is very much at the center of what we're calling now a multipolar world, and it's likely to continue to engage constructively with both sides. We just heard President Modi calling President Putin. So we think it will continue to, again, engage constructively with all sides. It cannot afford to do otherwise. Half of its exports going to the US will be subject to sanctions otherwise. So a lot more to see here, but we don't expect meaningful, concrete steps taking place in the very short term. So we see a lot of headlines, a lot of uncertainty, but that doesn't mean that India isn't an investable market for us, alongside many of the other emerging markets that we've seen sort of battered by headlines. But there's opportunities on the ground that we're picking up.
So, Giulia, I was going to ask you about some of the opportunities. First of all, what asset class in India looks attractive or could be attractive in the coming quarters?
So we've seen interesting moves in the Indian local bond space. Last year, obviously, a lot of interest because of their addition to major emerging market debt indices. Some of that initial excitement has obviously ended by now because that inclusion has occurred. Most recently, we've seen a sell-off in Indian local bonds. They have underperformed most of their emerging market peers, but we think that has now created some value that we could look to get involved in, because at the end of the day, because of these headlines around tariffs and global growth softening, we're likely to see a central bank in India that is grappling with solid growth, but a softening one, inflation well behaved, and possibly more room to cut than what the market price is in now. So potentially an opportunity to re-engage in the local bond trade there. And that is the case for many other emerging markets where we see similar dynamics. Solid fundamentals on one side, central banking officers having the room to reduce rates in the context of global growth and their domestic growth softening. And that creates an opportunity for the local currency trade for us.
Giulia, is there anything, I mean, when it comes to India, is there anything, for example, in the equity space? I know there's also a massive consumption gap with many more local retailers offering their own products. I don't know whether this is such a large economy that you could see opportunities in emerging companies.
The Indian economy has traditionally been relatively close to foreign companies and foreign investors. That is changing now. We think, given the space that has been created in the bond market, is probably more interesting for us, given the uncertainty still at the level of the consumer locally, at the level of measures to spur growth and to maintain it at sustained levels. So we prefer to be involved in the local bond space, rather.
Anywhere, when you look at other emerging markets, I mean, you're basically saying that India could be a mirror for other ones. Is it ones that went through structural pain, or where do you see the biggest value?
Well, we're seeing value in a lot of local markets, actually. A lot has occurred. A lot has moved in local markets. We've seen local markets in EM this year delivering nearly 14%. Two-thirds of that value has been delivered by moves in emerging market exchange rates because also of the change in the U.S. exceptionalism narrative, the weak dollar, that has created a lot of tailwind for any EMFX. So a lot of that has run its course. We think there's more to come, but we're slowly shifting into a second half of the year where global growth considerations are taking more of a hold. There's a sense that the global economy will be slowing down, and hence that will have repercussions on local growth prospects as well. So then we go back to a situation where some emerging markets will again have relatively solid fundamentals, but the opportunity to cut rates. So we see those opportunities.
Like which ones in terms of countries?
Brazil, in South Africa, in Mexico as well. So there's plenty of options to diversify. So what we're trying to highlight here is that, yes, there are lots of headlines and lots of upheaval from trade and geopolitics, but the opportunities for active managers to pick out those pockets of values are there. Again, South Africa, not always the easiest country, but you were noting yourself in your program earlier this morning, improvements in the electricity situation, an economy that is overall solid, that has made some fiscal gains, a government on national unity that is holding together and doing some reforms, and a central bank that is extremely credible and looking to lower its inflation target. That is meaning a structural reduction in interest rates locally that is very, very appealing for investors like us.
Giulia, give me a sense of what happens to dollar dynamics. So if the dollar weakens from here, again, who does it impact in terms of emerging markets?
Well, a weaker dollar is generally a positive news for all emerging markets. That means that, generally speaking, all EMFX will continue to perform well. And that is indeed what we're going to continue to see in our base case. So we will likely remain involved in many of the EM currencies, again, the rand, the Brazilian real, the Mexican peso, and so on. So these are some of the ones we like the most, but also the Turkish lira, which is a more idiosyncratic case, perhaps. What we're saying is that in the second half of the year, that gets boosted further by the opportunity on the local rate side as well. So an overall very constructive year for emerging markets, and one where we're seeing a lot of opportunities after years of the asset class being a bit in the doldrums.
Giulia, thank you so much for joining us. Giulia Pellegrini there, Emerging Markets Portfolio Manager at Allianz Global Investors. Now, coming up, oil sliding today as traders weigh the outlook for a ceasefire in Ukraine. We'll discuss that next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. S&P has affirmed its AA plus rating for the U.S., saying tariff revenues will partially offset weaker fiscal revenues from Donald Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill. Let's get more from our very own Valerie Teitel. Hi, Valerie.
Hey, good morning, Francine. Maybe not a surprise that they reaffirmed the AA rating, but the reasonings behind it were quite interesting. S&P Ratings calling the tariff revenue meaningful in its statement overnight, saying we expect the meaningful tariff revenue to generally offset the weaker weaker fiscal outcomes from that big, beautiful bill that just passed in the Senate earlier this year. Now, this comes at an interesting time because if we look at what's going on in the back end of the bond market, it does look like yields are starting to creep higher, and we're attempting 5% in that 30-year yield. So maybe the bond market isn't necessarily buying for now that these tariff revenues could pay for those tax cuts and spending increases in that big, beautiful bill. But over the last 4 days, we're up 10 basis points on the 30-year yield at 4.94. But this phenomenon of yields moving higher in the back end is not just going on in the U.S. We're also seeing it here in Europe. Yesterday, the UK 30-year gilt yield reached the highest since 1998, another new year-to-date high for the back-end yields. Germany and French yields as well on Friday. No clear catalyst, but hit a 14-year high for both of those names. So it goes to show that this move in the back end of the bond market is confusing some, but do remember September is a very busy month for issuance, especially in Europe. So perhaps some concession being built into the back end of the bond market. Francine?
Valerie, thank you so much. Valerie Teitel there. Now, oil sliding today as traders weigh the outlook for a ceasefire in Ukraine. President Trump pushing for a summit between Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky after a series of high-level talks. Well, joining us now is Al Nightingale, our Europe oil markets editor. Al, thank you. So what's happening with oil right now?
So obviously the traders are watching those negotiations very closely. But I don't know that they're kind of taking a strong view on the outcomes. We've seen so many kind of geopolitical things come and go in the oil market, and traders, when you're looking for real positions and real kind of taking a view, they want to see things that are definitely going to affect supply or definitely going to affect demand. And I don't think either of these negotiations clearly do that. So what we're looking at really right now is a more of an ongoing picture of supply and demand and how people are viewing that. And I think going later into this year, there is an expectation for oversupply, and maybe over, in the past few weeks, we've seen the market starting to lose some steam.
So, Al, talk to us about OPEC Plus. What are we expecting from OPEC Plus in the future? And again, if you look at the price of oil, it could stay in this holding pattern. Well,
that's a really interesting question. For quite some time now, they've obviously been adding supply. They've kind of completed this round of supply increases. The delegates that we've spoken to have said that they could now do anything. They could increase, they could just keep supply the same, or they could actually cut supply in their next kind of meetings. Mm-hmm. So that creates an uncertainty and kind of puts guardrails around oil. Obviously, if they were to cut supply, then that changes the kind of expectations for supply-demand dynamics. Equally, if we do keep having this sort of weakness in prices, then maybe next year some of the supply expectations will come off if you get less investment in oil. So there are reasons to kind of be bullish and bearish, and that's, I think, why you're seeing that holding pattern that you talked about.
Al, what's the latest on China buying Russian crude oil?
Yeah, China does seem to be buying a bit more Russian crude. If you look at the proportions of the seaborne flows, it's India is what matters here, and they are very cautious about US sanctions at the moment. They're still buying or being subjected to US sanctions. They're still buying. There is a deadline in a few weeks' time where they could face more aggressive US measures, secondary tariffs. If that were to happen, then India could kind of create a void, and we would have to see what China would do. A lot of people think, it will go somewhere, and that's the nature of the oil market. It goes somewhere. So we have to just see how that plays out and, how it really goes in time. Ultimately, will the US want to risk supply? I don't think so. And that's where you always have to think, will the US be willing to lose supply? Probably not.
So interesting. Al, thank you so much. Alric Nightingale there with the very latest on oil. Now, Hamas says it has agreed to a truce deal proposed by Qatar and Egypt to pause fighting with Israel in Gaza. A diplomat told Bloomberg that the proposal would see Hamas release half of the hostages it still holds in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners and a partial withdrawal of Israeli troops. Now, it's not clear whether Israel has received the proposal or whether it would agree to the terms. In other news, full-year underlying profit at BHP has fallen by more than a quarter to its lowest level since the pandemic. The results from the world's largest miner were broadly in line with expectations and came as prices of BHP's key earners, iron ore and coking coal, coming under pressure from softer Chinese demand.
Everybody's chasing higher standards of living. To feed that growth, to feed those higher standards of living, the reality is the world's going to need more of the commodities that BHP produces. There's more steel needed to build cities, more copper needed not only to electrify the world, but for data centers, so for AI. And so we've tried to orient the BHP portfolio towards those commodities that the world's going to need more of.
Now, as summer temperatures rise, some of London's wealthier residents are looking to install air conditioning units in their homes. However, their plans are often being thwarted by local councils for technical and aesthetic reasons. Well, we're now joined by Olivia Woodgard from Bloomberg Green. Olivia, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, this is one of our most read stories in the terminal today, because people are kind of either confused or trying to understand exactly what's blocking the uptake of aircon.
Yeah, so there's a few different things going on. I mean, one of them is that London has a very, it's very well motivated cooling hierarchy. So councils are basically told prioritise passive measures like, like shading ahead of things like air conditioning because of climate concerns. And another thing is that there's a lot of buildings that have conservation or aesthetic protections. So if you have a building that is deemed to be architecturally very valuable, it's difficult really to do a lot of things to it. So a lot of people are finding that they're applying and they're being told either you have to jump through all these hoops and it takes a long time, or you're sort of being denied altogether.
Yeah, so why are Londoners finding overheating at home to be such a problem?
I mean, London has the same issue that a lot of cities in the Northern Hemisphere have.
Big cities, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's it's not well adapted for climate change. So, there's this really interesting mix of building stock. Some of it is Victorian homes that have these kind of big floor-to-ceiling windows. In some cases, you might have newer build properties that actually what's happened is they're very well insulated, but there hasn't been a lot of thought given to ventilation. And as temperatures rise because of climate change, especially overnight, people are finding that it's actually very uncomfortable.
There are, I imagine, serious health implications for overheating homes.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially at night. So what you often find is that if you have several days of a heat wave, people are not able to recover at night. They're still suffering, they're still overheating. It actually accentuates a lot of those long-term health problems and more acute health problems that you get as a result of heat. So that's stress on the heart, stress on the respiratory system, and it can actually be a very serious health risk.
So, Olivia, I mean, new housing is being built without aircon. What's taking so long to change regulation?
Well, so like I say, a lot of it is actually around it's prioritising more passive measures. So the planning rules actually say that housing developers should be prioritising things like smaller windows and shading, which is very well intentioned. It's air conditioning. It puts a lot of strain on the grid. It's historically been not favoured because of the carbon implications. But actually, there are calls now for some of that to be changed because we are seeing this really acute heating and overheating risk.
So, Olivia, is policy around air conditioning changing? Is it going to change in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, so there have actually been a couple of changes. Well, there's been one that's already happened this year. So there's something called permitted development, which is where there are certain changes you can make to your home without having to ask for permission. And actually, the government has added air conditioning units that can both heat and cool to that rule earlier this year. That could actually have arguably some climate benefits because people maybe then aren't using their gas boilers in the winter as much. They're using their air conditioning unit to heat. The other thing that might happen is there's a subsidy program for heat pumps. So an air conditioner is really just a form of heat pump. And the government is currently considering allowing people to get that subsidy, some level of subsidy for a heat pump that can both heat and cool as well.
All right, Olivia, thank you so much. Olivia Woodgard there on aircon in London. Now, quickly, a lot going on, of course, with Intel, the Trump administration in discussion to take a stake of about 10% of Intel by converting grants made under the U.S. Chips and Science Act into equity. The other story is, of course, Softbank seeing a potential for a turnaround at Intel, with the government valuing the company's manufacturing prowess and actually putting quite a lot of money in Intel. Up next, Bloomberg Brief. They'll also talk about Jay Powell and Jackson Hole. This is Bloomberg.